The night was quiet when the sky suddenly lit up with streaks of fire. The people of the colony rushed outside, pointing upward in fear and wonder. Massive shapes were descending through the clouds, glowing like falling stars. Some of the children cried, while the adults whispered prayers. The ships slowed and hovered, their surfaces shining with a strange golden light. To the colonists who had not seen advanced technology in many years, the sight felt unreal, almost holy. The ships landed outside the settlement with a deep rumble that shook the ground. Dust and light covered the air, and when it cleared, figures emerged. They were tall, taller than any human, wrapped in radiant armor that gleamed as if forged from the sun. Their voices echoed unnaturally, carried by hidden devices that made every word thunder. "Kneel," one of them commanded, and without thinking, many humans dropped to their knees. The fear of the unknown weighed heavier than pride. The figures moved with slow, deliberate steps, each motion designed to impress. One held a staff that sparked with blue energy, striking the ground with a flash that made the colonists gasp. To the people who had only known old machines and broken tools, it looked like magic. The leader raised his hand and declared, "We are your gods. You belong to us now." His words spread through the crowd like a cold wind. No one dared to speak. A farmer clutched his wife's hand, trembling. A mother shielded her child, but even she lowered her head in fear. For years, the colony had been cut off from Earth. Supplies had stopped, and messages never came. They felt abandoned, forgotten, left to survive with whatever little they had. Now, before them stood beings who claimed power beyond imagination. The thought that they might really be gods did not seem so impossible. The aliens walked among the people, examining them as one might inspect animals. They were taller than any soldier the colonists remembered, with glowing patterns etched into their armor. Their helmets had no faces, only shining plates that reflected the humans' own frightened expressions back at them. One of the armored figures touched a broken water pump, waved his staff, and the pump sparked to life. Water spilled out, clean and fresh. The people gasped. Some cried out, "A miracle!" The aliens said nothing, only nodding as if they had proven their divinity. Soon, the so-called gods ordered the colonists to gather food, tools, and livestock. "All belongs to us," they said. The people obeyed, afraid of the blue energy that crackled at the end of the staffs. A man who hesitated was struck in the chest. A flash of light sent him sprawling, his body smoking. The crowd screamed. The man coughed blood, alive but broken. Everyone else quickly moved faster, carrying whatever the aliens demanded. Fear turned obedience into instinct. That night, the colony square was filled with torches and frightened faces. The aliens stood tall on a raised platform, looking down like kings of old. "We will protect you," their leader said, "but you must worship us. Sacrifice, obedience, and loyalty are the price for our blessings." His voice echoed unnaturally through the night, making the words feel heavier than stone. The colonists murmured, some clapping their hands together in prayer, others silently crying. For the first time in many years, the people believed they were not alone, but what stood before them was not salvation. It was chains wrapped in light. The children asked questions in hushed voices. "Are they really gods?" one whispered. A mother pressed her hand over her son's mouth, too afraid to let him speak. An old man, his back bent with age, muttered quietly, "No god bleeds. Remember that." But his words were swallowed by the loud commands of the armored figures. No one dared to repeat them. The aliens began assigning roles. Strong young men were taken to carry supplies. Women were ordered to cook and clean for them. Children were told to kneel and sing songs of praise. The colony's spirit bent under the weight of fear. Some wanted to resist, but they remembered the man who had been struck down. His screams still echoed in their minds. Better to live in silence than to die in fire. Days turned into weeks, and the illusion of divinity grew stronger. Every time the aliens used their weapons or repaired a broken machine, the colonists fell to their knees in awe. Some even began to bow whenever one of the towering figures passed. They called them Lords of Light and Divine Masters. The aliens encouraged it, speaking less like visitors and more like rulers. They promised prosperity but demanded more each day. More food, more labor, more submission. The humans grew thinner, weaker, but their fear was greater than their hunger. Still, doubt lingered in hidden places. A few colonists noticed the aliens eating greedily at night, tearing into meat and drinking water like any mortal. They saw one stumble and clutch his side after removing his armor. The glimpse of pale, wounded flesh haunted them. Perhaps they were not gods after all. Yet, fear kept the truth locked inside their throats. Speaking against them felt like inviting death. The settlement changed. Songs of worship replaced laughter. The people walked with lowered heads. The colony, once full of hope, was now a temple built on fear. The aliens stood at the center, tall and glowing, but their glow could not hide the shadows they cast. To the humans, they were gods because no one had yet dared to prove otherwise. But somewhere in the hearts of the colonists, a quiet thought refused to die. If they were truly gods, why did they need food, shelter, and slaves? Why did they strike down the weak and demand sacrifice? The question whispered in the silence of the night, waiting for the day when someone brave enough would answer it. The so-called gods wasted no time in showing their power. At dawn, they ordered the colony to assemble in the square. The humans came trembling, carrying what little food and goods they had. The armored figures stood above them, their glowing staffs crackling with blue energy. The leader's voice rang out, commanding them to kneel again. No one dared disobey. He declared that sacrifices must be given, not only of harvest and livestock, but also of lives, if needed. His words chilled every heart. Families clutched each other, too afraid to breathe. The first act of tyranny was swift. A young man tried to hide a basket of grain, hoping to keep it for his sick mother. One of the armored figures caught him, dragged him into the center, and struck him with a blast of energy. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. The people screamed, but none moved to help him. He survived, writhing on the ground, a warning to everyone else. "This is what happens when mortals defy gods," the alien said coldly. The colony fell silent, their hope crushed under fear. The new rulers divided the days into rituals. Every morning, the colonists had to bring offerings of food, metal, and wood. At night, they were forced to chant praises, songs that the aliens themselves dictated. The humans obeyed, their voices weak and filled with dread. Those who hesitated were beaten or shocked by the staffs. The children cried as their parents bowed, and the old muttered curses in secret. Yet no one had the courage to rise. One by one, freedoms disappeared. The gods demanded labor for building strange structures around the colony, tall spires of metal that pulsed with alien light. No one knew their purpose, but the aliens called them altars. Workers collapsed under the strain, but the overseers showed no mercy. Anyone who slowed down was whipped with energy lashes. At night, the aliens feasted on the best food while the humans went hungry. Still, the colonists were told it was an honor to serve. The fear grew heavier each day. The colonists began whispering that maybe it was better this way, that maybe giving everything would keep them safe. Yet deep inside, doubt spread like a hidden fire. Some noticed that their gods grew tired, that their armor was dented after work, that their glowing staffs sometimes flickered. They were powerful, yes, but not flawless. Still, no one dared speak these thoughts aloud. An elder watched quietly as the aliens strutted through the colony like kings. He remembered old Earth wars, stories of men and women who fought against empires far stronger than themselves. He clenched his fist and whispered to himself, "They bleed. I saw it. Gods do not bleed." His words were almost lost in the noise of chanting voices, but those closest to him heard. Fear kept them from agreeing. But hope flickered in their eyes. The tyranny of the so-called gods was complete. Every human bowed when they passed. Every meal was stolen to fill alien stomachs. Every moment of the day was ruled by their commands. Yet even as the colony sank into despair, the cracks were beginning to show. The illusion was powerful, but illusions could break. And the people, though afraid, were starting to see their chains for what they truly were. The nights became the only refuge from the glowing staffs and the thunderous voices of the so-called gods. When darkness fell and the aliens retreated to their strange spires, a few colonists gathered in secret. They met inside the ruins of an old warehouse, its broken roof letting in slices of moonlight. They spoke in whispers, fearful that the armored giants could hear even their thoughts. The air was heavy with fear, but also with something else, an ember of defiance that refused to die. A young mechanic named Jace spread out scraps of parchment covered in rough sketches. He had been secretly observing the gods' weapons, their armor, and their movements. He pointed to where the staff's glow dimmed for a second after each strike. "It needs to recharge," he whispered, his voice trembling but determined. The others leaned closer, listening as if hearing forbidden knowledge. A farmer nodded slowly, remembering the hesitation he saw in one of the figures during a raid. These details gave shape to the unspoken truth. Their enemies were not divine. They were flesh and blood. An elder woman spoke next, her voice cracked with age but strong with memory. She recalled Earth's stories of resistance, when ordinary people had stood against empires and machines far greater than themselves. Humans have faced worse, she reminded them. Her words did not erase fear, but they planted courage like seeds in a barren field. The colonists looked at one another with new eyes. For the first time, they began to see themselves not as worshippers, but as survivors who might fight back. They started collecting small details each day. A boy pretended to play near the spires while secretly counting how many aliens entered and left. A woman carried water to the guards and noticed which ones limped, which ones favored a wounded arm. They kept these fragments of knowledge hidden, passing them around like treasure. Every piece of information was a weapon waiting to be used. Yet the fear never left. Every time they gathered, they knew discovery meant death. Once, during a meeting, heavy footsteps echoed outside the warehouse. The group froze, holding their breath as shadows passed across the cracked windows. A staff's glow flared briefly, lighting the walls. Hearts pounded until the sound faded. Only when silence returned did they dare to breathe again. In that moment, they realized their lives were already in the hands of monsters. If they were to die, better to die fighting. The quiet resistance grew, though it remained hidden. They shared no grand speeches, only nods and silent agreements. A basket of food left near a door meant the family inside had seen a weakness. A piece of cloth tied to a fence post meant another had joined the cause. Without words, the colony was weaving a web of defiance under the noses of their oppressors. Jace repaired an old transmitter he found buried beneath rubble. The machine was ancient, parts rusted and fragile, but he worked night after night in secret, using scraps stolen from the aliens' refuse. His hands bled, his eyes burned with exhaustion, but he whispered to himself with each turn of the wrench, "Someone out there will hear us." When at last the transmitter hummed weakly to life, the small group gathered around it. They sent a single desperate message into the void. "This is Outpost 17. False gods enslave us. If humanity still lives, we beg for help." They sat in silence after the signal went out, listening to static. Some wept quietly, others clutched their children, praying someone might answer. For days, nothing came, and hope dimmed. But the seed of rebellion had been planted too deeply to die. Even without a reply, they kept watching, waiting, gathering strength. The illusion of gods was cracking, and the colonists had taken their first step toward breaking it forever. The transmitter sat in silence for many nights, its weak light flickering like a dying candle. The colonists almost gave up hope that anyone would ever hear them. They carried on with their hidden meetings, watching the aliens, writing down every flaw, every mistake, but despair was always close. Then, one cold evening, when the stars shone sharp against the dark sky, the machine crackled. At first it was only static, harsh and broken, but then a voice cut through. It was rough, distant, but unmistakably human. "Outpost 17, message received, hold fast." Every heart in the room froze. No one spoke. The voice came again, clearer this time. "You are not forgotten. Reinforcements inbound." The colonists stared at one another, disbelief written on their faces. Some wept openly, covering their mouths to muffle the sound. Others clenched their fists in silent triumph. For the first time in years, they felt the weight of abandonment lift from their shoulders. Humanity still lived, and it was coming for them. Jace fell to his knees in relief, his hands trembling as he adjusted the transmitter to confirm the signal. The group crowded around, desperate to hear more, but the machine sputtered and went silent again. The old circuits had burned out, smoke curling into the air. It was dead now, but it didn't matter. The message had been enough. The colonists carried this secret like fire in their chests. They could not tell everyone. Not yet, for fear the aliens might learn of it. But the knowledge spread quietly, whispered in corners, passed from lips to ears with cautious smiles. "Help is coming," they murmured. The words gave strength to the weary, courage to the broken. The aliens, unaware of what had happened, continued their cruel rituals. They demanded more sacrifices, more offerings, more obedience. But something had shifted in the colony. When they bowed, the humans bowed slower. When they sang songs of praise, their voices carried less fear. The gods did not notice, too drunk on their own illusion of power to sense the change. One night, an elder stood at the edge of the gathering and whispered to a group of children, "Do not be afraid. Remember this night. Soon you will see what real power looks like." His eyes shone with a strength that had been missing for too long. The children nodded, holding on to his words as tightly as they held their parents' hands. The waiting was painful. Days passed with no further signal, no proof that the message had reached anyone beyond that single crackling reply. Doubt tried to creep back into their hearts, whispering that maybe it was a dream. But every time fear rose, they remembered the voice of a human across the stars promising them that they were not alone. Each night, the secret meetings grew bolder. They began hiding tools, sharpening blades, even setting aside bits of food for the day when the sky would tremble again. Every act of defiance, however small, was fueled by the memory of that voice. The colonists had been powerless for too long, but now they had something their captors could not take away: hope. And hope was dangerous. High above, in the endless dark of space, something massive was already on its way, moving closer with every passing day. The colonists did not know when it would arrive, but they clung to the promise like lifelines. The false gods believed their illusion unbreakable, but the humans knew the truth now. And when the warship came, that illusion would shatter. The colony square was filled again, the false gods demanding new tributes. They stood taller than ever, their voices booming across the trembling humans. Yet this time, the fear did not run as deep. The people watched with sharper eyes, and what they saw was not perfection. One alien's armor bore a dent from some unseen blow. Another's staff flickered before sparking back to life. Sweat glistened beneath their helmets when they thought no one was looking. The illusion of divinity was beginning to crumble. A boy no older than 12 stood in the crowd clutching a stone. His mother tried to pull his hand down, whispering frantically, but the boy's anger burned hotter than his fear. When one of the gods strode past, demanding more grain, the boy hurled the stone with all his strength. It struck the giant's side with a hollow clang. The alien turned, furious, raising his staff. Before the crowd's horrified eyes, the boy was struck down, his body writhing in pain. But what the people remembered was not his fall. It was the thin line of red blood that dripped from the dented armor where the stone had hit. Gasps spread through the crowd. They had seen it. The elders' whispered truth had been proven. Gods did not bleed. Yet here was blood, dark and undeniable. The aliens shouted for silence, their voices shaking with rage. They beat the boy and dragged him away, but the damage was done. The people had seen too much. Fear still chained their bodies, but in their hearts a wall had cracked. That night, whispers spread like wildfire. In every home, behind every closed door, families repeated the same words. They are not gods. They can be hurt. The story of the boy and the blood reached every ear. Even those who had been most loyal now looked at their rulers with suspicion. Some dared to laugh quietly in the shadows, a sound that had been missing for far too long. The aliens, uneasy with the shift they could not fully understand, grew harsher. They demanded longer hours of labor, larger sacrifices, and louder prayers. Their punishments grew crueler, as if violence could restore the illusion. But the more they tried to tighten their grip, the more their power slipped through their fingers. The humans now knelt slowly, their voices hollow in forced chants. Behind their lowered eyes burned defiance. The elder who had once whispered in secret now spoke more boldly. Standing by the firelight, he reminded the small gatherings of what they had all witnessed. They bleed, they hunger, they fear. They are no different from us, and if they can be wounded, they can be defeated. His words carried weight, not as legend, but as truth. The colonists nodded, their fear reshaped into anger. The so-called gods walked the colony with arrogance, but their steps were heavier now, their gazes sharper, as though they knew the people's hearts were changing. What had once been unquestioned obedience was now a dangerous silence. In that silence lay the promise of rebellion, waiting for the right moment. The illusion of gods had cracked, and the crack was spreading wider every day. The night was split open by thunder that did not belong to any storm. The ground trembled, cups rattled off tables, and children cried out as the sky itself tore apart. Every colonist rushed outside, staring upward in awe and terror. A shadow loomed above the clouds, vast and dark, blocking out the stars. It was no alien spire, no glowing false miracle. It was sharp-edged, armored, unmistakably human. A warship descended through the atmosphere, its engines roaring like the voice of a giant. The false gods scrambled, their voices no longer calm or commanding. They barked orders at one another in their native tongue, rushing to power up their ships and weapons. The colonists, watching from the square, saw the truth written plainly in their movements. Their gods were afraid. The towering figures who had once demanded worship now ran like soldiers preparing for battle they did not want to fight. The illusion was shattering before their eyes. The warship's cannons hummed, glowing brighter than the staffs that had once terrified the colony. A low, vibrating hum swept across the land, making every bone in the humans' bodies shake. The colonists clutched each other, not in fear of the ship, but in awe of its power. One woman whispered, tears streaming down her face, "That's ours. That's human." Her words spread through the crowd like fire, their fear giving way to something fiercer: pride. The first strike came like a hammer from the heavens. A bolt of light ripped across the sky, smashing into one of the alien spires. The structure exploded into shards of burning metal, raining down like sparks from a forge. The colonists gasped, their chains of fear breaking with every piece of falling debris. The false gods screamed orders, their staffs flaring uselessly against the overwhelming force that had arrived. For the first time, the humans saw the aliens stumble backward, their armor no longer radiant, but dull beneath the fiery glow of the warship's guns. The colonists could feel it deep in their bones. This was the moment when the balance had shifted. The ones who claimed to be gods had been reduced to frightened mortals, scrambling beneath the gaze of a true power. Above, the warship's engines roared again, shaking the very air. The colonists raised their eyes, no longer in prayer to false idols, but in recognition of the truth. Humanity had returned, and the sky itself carried their fury. The warship opened fire with a fury the colony had never witnessed. Railgun slugs ripped through the night, glowing streaks that tore the sky apart. Alien ships tried to rise, their engines screaming, but they were shredded before they could even reach the clouds. Explosions lit up the horizon, each blast shaking the ground and rattling the bones of every onlooker. The colonists stood frozen, their fear melting into stunned disbelief. The gods who had ruled them with fire and terror were being crushed in minutes. The false gods fought desperately, unleashing their staffs in blinding arcs of blue. Beams lashed out toward the warship, but its shields flared, shrugging off the attacks as if they were sparks from a dying flame. The humans on the ground saw panic in their captors' movements, their once calm and measured strides replaced with frantic scrambling. The towering figures, who had demanded songs of worship, now screamed in their own language, retreating from a storm they could not control. One of the alien leaders attempted to rally his forces, raising his staff high, shouting for the colonists to shield them as loyal worshippers, but no one moved. The crowd that once obeyed out of fear now only stared with cold, vengeful eyes. A child, the same boy who had seen his friend beaten, shouted from the crowd, "You're no gods!" His cry was met with silence, then a rising chorus of voices repeating the same words. The spell of divinity was broken. A final strike from the warship's main cannon split the night open, a beam of white fire that engulfed the enemy's command vessel. The blast turned it into a burning star, fragments scattering across the plain. The shockwave toppled one of the alien spires, crushing several of the armored figures beneath its weight. The ground shook with their screams, sharp and raw, not divine wails, but the cries of mortals meeting death. The colonists began to cheer, first in whispers, then in shouts, until their voices thundered across the square, louder than the staff blasts, louder than the explosions. The people who had once bowed in chains now raised their fists toward the sky. Their tears were not of sorrow, but of release. The fear that had ruled them for so long was burned away in the fire of the warship's guns. As the last of the alien ships fell, silence rolled over the land, broken only by the hiss of smoldering wreckage. The colonists stood together, their chains no longer heavy, Above them, the warship loomed, a fortress of steel and power, its shadow falling across the broken remains of false gods. The humans looked up with awe, not in worship, but in recognition of their own strength. They knew then that no matter how dark the night, humanity would always return with fire. The silence after the battle felt heavier than the noise of war. Smoke curled into the air, carrying the bitter stench of burned metal and scorched earth. The colonists stood in the open square, stunned and trembling, staring at the ruins of the spires that had once cast shadows over their lives. The so-called gods lay scattered, their radiant armor broken, their staffs lifeless. Some still breathed, groaning like wounded animals, stripped of the fear they once commanded. The people did not rush to help them. They only watched, the power of terror finally gone from their eyes. The warship hovered above, its bulk casting a long shadow over the colony. Then a beam of light descended, and a figure appeared. A human captain clad not in glowing armor, but in practical steel, his voice carried through a communicator. "People of Outpost 17, he said, his tone firm yet steady, "you are free." The words rang louder than any command the false gods had ever spoken. The crowd erupted, some crying, some laughing, some collapsing to their knees in pure relief. The captain continued, his eyes stern but warm. "These were no gods, only tyrants who sought to break you. But you endured, you resisted, and now humanity stands with you again." His words washed over the people like a tide, filling the cracks left by years of despair. For the first time in memory, the colony felt whole. Children ran through the square, shouting joyfully, no longer silenced by fear. Families embraced, holding one another as though they had been lost and found again. The elder, who had once whispered that gods did not bleed, stood tall and proud, tears rolling down his weathered face. He looked up at the warship and whispered, "I told them the truth." Around him, others repeated the same words, no longer whispers, but proud declarations. The broken aliens were dragged into the ruins of their own altars, left to face the fate of mortals. Their cries carried no weight anymore. No one bowed, no one trembled. The illusion was shattered, and the memory of their false reign would live only as a warning. The colonists lifted their eyes once more to the warship. It remained steady, a guardian above them. In that moment, they understood something deeper than freedom. They had been reminded of who they were. Not worshippers, not slaves, but human beings, descendants of a people who had faced darkness 1,000 times before and had always fought their way back into the light. From that day, the story spread across the stars. No matter how many came pretending to be gods, no matter how bright their weapons or how loud their voices, humanity would never bow forever. When the warship arrived, the truth always followed. Gods could fall, but humans endured.